Come, take a seat and listen to my tales of wonder and woe, for I have many to tell. Before we begin, I ask you to disregard all preconceived notions you have about fairy tales, as well as myths, and how you believe they are meant to end, for most of those will be promptly disregarded through the telling of these two stories. Now that that's out of the way, I believe I can begin with the first story, the story of the Fae. Now my grandmother told me a plethora of stories, from brutal to beautiful, for she had no fear that I could not handle the stories that she was told as a child as well. This story was told to me after I learned I had a reaction to nickel, causing rashes and bumps around the surrounding skin for a couple of days afterwards. I was quite distraught over this, for I had gotten a watch that I now couldn't wear, which was the most distressing thing 7-year-old me really had to deal with at the time. So, as my grandmother did, she sat me down and told me a tale. She told me of the Fae, who I assure you in this story are not the humans with wings you are picturing. These Fae were born from dead flowers and insect corpses, ergo they retained some of those features. Petals grow like scales, leaf-like eyelashes, inky dark eyes like those of an insect, antennae sprouting from their forehead, skin with vibrant shades and peculiar markings, from electrically purple veins across cheeks to deeply colored freckles. Their skin and wings, though, were delicate, just like a petal or a bug. This is why they had such an aversion to iron in particular, which was too harsh for their wings and skin. But over the years, the Fae realized they could no longer continue to live in this realm, in the woods, or in their own lands, for the humans began to move and hunt them. So while some escaped to the realm of magic, others had to integrate themselves into our society. Due to iron being such an often used metal, over the years, they began developing an immunity. They had to, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to participate in mere daily activities. Now, because it was so common, they did grow an immunity to iron, but some of the aversion lingers even today. The descendants of the Fae, they still have that slight aversion. Most, not to iron, but to nickel, to other metals that are very common, but you just peculiarly have an aversion to. Everybody else is fine, but you? Not you. Perhaps it is just a normal occurrence, genetics, or something like that. Or maybe, just maybe, the Fae still linger in your bloodline. The next story is a story not told for any moral lesson. It was just a tale my grandmother told me one day when I asked. I wanted a story. She asked me, "Do you want something happy?" And I thought about it, looked at the rain outside, and said, "I don't think that it's the kind of day for that." So, she did not tell me a happy story. Now I do warn, this story is far less pleasant and far more depressing. It does not make you feel warm or fuzzy. In fact, it left me feeling the opposite. My grandmother didn't intend for this. She only intended to tell a story, the story I asked for, in fact. And it was quite interesting at that. But before we begin this one, I do warn you. This does involve a couple of difficult topics, and I just want to be sure that all of you are safe. Continuing. One day, in a town, a god manifested. She came seemingly out of the blue, with no purpose or intention. No one knew how to handle her, for she could not even hear with her head being all the way up in the clouds, closer to the sun than to us. She demolished large areas of land with a step, and it took weeks before the town she manifested in could call for help. They called for not military or supplies, but sacrifice. They assumed she must need one. That's what all gods require when they cause destruction, right? And so, they found one. The neighboring kingdom sent a girl. They insisted the girl was too ugly to marry, too young and poor of health to work. So this was to become her fate instead. It's what to be expected of someone who cannot conform to what her society desires. So she bowed her head, and she boarded the ship to the town that would, to her presumption, cause her demise. She was brought by ship to the near-demolished town. The soldiers gave her pitying looks. She did not let the harsh look on her face drop, even as she was shakily stepping onto the land. The town was in shambles, where the goddess sat amongst the rubble, playing with a full-grown buck as if it were naught but a toy. The girl was forced on land, where she arrived at the legs of the goddess. Her head reached the clouds. Only the tips of her long white hair could be seen. The girl called up, but the goddess could not hear her, so the girl decided to climb. She climbed the trees in attempts to make the goddess listen to her call, but the trees were not tall enough. So she hiked up a hill, yet the hill was not tall enough. So finally, she hiked near halfway up a mountain, and finally, once at the midway to the tip of this mountain, when she could not climb any more, she calls again and again. Yet this time, the goddess hears. She tilts her head towards the girl, acknowledging her. She takes her from the mountain and places her back on the ground, before shrinking down to a mortal height, better to interact with the girl. But still, she was taller than any mortal, and you could tell just by her face, by the golden halos, if you could call them that. They spun around her head. They had runes that the girl had never seen engraved on them. Yet somehow she knew they meant something important. They were what the goddess was made of. Take those rings of spinning gold, and the goddess basically has no name. Once they were both safely on the ground, the girl asked the goddess her name. She said she had none. For someone who has never existed before this point, wouldn't. So the girl told the goddess hers. The goddess decided on a name similar to the meaning of the girl's. Her name would be Hecate, meaning of the sky and stars. Afterward, the goddess and the girl grew closer. The girl explains the mortal world best she can, trying not to let the bitterness in her situation slip, because she doesn't want the goddess to think that the world is cruel, despite the fact that, to her, to many, it is. And so, once the girl lets some of her story slip, the goddess gave her 7 days of glory. It is said this is why we have 7 days to a week. She built her a castle of roots from trees and jewels found in the earth. She was given the most lovely of beds, the best of food, and the goddess even mended her hand, which had been injured months ago, but she hadn't had the money to mend it. After the 7 days ended, Hecate posed an unassumingly important question, right outside the castle border. "Would you be my closest friend, forever?" she asked, hugging the girl tightly. "Of course," she said foolishly, believing one day she would have to die. Forever's too long for a mortal. "You promise?" "I promise." So the girl was thrust into being the closest companion of one of the most powerful goddesses to ever exist in ours or even the next lifetime. She was only slightly behind life herself. For now, she's young, not even 100 at this point. They were not quite sure what she would become, who she might surpass. But eventually, the girl grew older. She became wrinkled, sickly, and eventually bedbound. One day Hecate asked why she could not move and act as she did years ago. The concept of aging was impossible to her. She knew it happened, but not to her friend, not to the girl she cared about. The girl, now an old woman, admitted she was dying, very quickly at that. Hecate didn't understand. The girl had promised to be her friend, forever, and it had barely been a snippet of the goddess's lifetime. She couldn't have lied to her, could she? Finally, the girl let out her last raspy breath, and a man draped in a cloak of deep red appeared next to her bedside. "Get out!" Hecate shouts, baring her razor-blade teeth that had scared off thousands of enemies before. "You know I can't do that, Hecate." "Move, please," he said calmly. She lunged forward. They say the fight between Death and Hecate lasted for nearly a month. It was bloody, and people say they ripped each other apart at the very atomic level, and yet they would still come back, doing it again and again and again. In the end, though, despite all the odds, despite her youth, despite everything that says she shouldn't have won, Hecate came out the victor, soaked in the blood of Death himself. That's when the goddess's power was revealed. She was fate. She was life. She was death. She was everything in between and beyond, all at once. Afterwards, she brought back the girl with ease, replenishing her back to her youth, declaring the girl her betrothed. At first, the girl was giddy with the power that suddenly pumped through her veins. She could physically feel it. She could feel her speed. She could feel her strength, everything. But it didn't take long for her to grow weary. She was not nearly as powerful as the gods surrounding her. But it was also clear she was no mortal witch, fae, or dryad. Once more, she was stuck between lives. Nowhere to go. And this time, she didn't have an island or a goddess to run away to, because they're gods. If they want to find you, they can. She watched her family and friends die out. Eventually, she stopped speaking to mortals, even for fun. But what was the point of if their lives were not but a second to hers? Eventually, she disappeared. Some say she died. Some say she walks through space itself, aimlessly looking for a way to leave this realm. Others say she still lives among us, changing her form every once in a while, but endlessly staying among us. It doesn't really matter, for in reality, her story isn't really hers. She's nothing but an accessory to Hecate's tale. Have you noticed she never got a name? Never was her past told in specifics. Never did she truly get a story for herself. For she is nothing but a person in somebody else's story. For Hecate is a goddess. She's mentioned in plenty of the other tales I will one day tell. So her trail is nothing but a tragedy wrapped in a mist of unknown and impossibilities, because the story was never about her. And what's worse than never being known for anything but the person who dragged you into a miserable life that you didn't ask for.